If you live in a predominantly English-speaking country, and are also the kind of person who watches these videos, you might have heard this story before. Inasmuch as medieval Jewish history gets talked about at all, I've always assumed that the story of England in particular gets special attention due to good old-fashioned Anglocentrism. And the way it's typically presented, that does seem to be the case. Make Jewish history interesting to the English-speaking world by relating it to the English-speaking world in a way that's still representative of the medieval Jewish experience in Christian Europe as a whole. But here's the thing, that isn't true at all. The history of the Jews in England is weird, and even when it does parallel continental Europe, it's always a little different. First of all, let's go back to Roman times. Was there a Jewish presence in Roman Britain? Doesn't matter. It would be strange if there wasn't, but we don't have any evidence that there was. Certainly there didn't seem to have been any Jews in Anglo-Saxon England because when the Normans conquered it, they had to import their own. Also very weird. To my knowledge, no other country has ever deliberately imported a Jewish community in order to make their society function. See, up to this point, the Anglo-Saxon kings had accepted taxes in kind, that is, in the form of agricultural produce or labor. The Normans, whose royalty and nobility weren't tied to the land in the same way that the Anglo-Saxons had been, just wanted cash. And to manage that cash, in 1070, King William the Conqueror invited a handful of Jewish merchants from Rouen to serve as moneylenders. This was around the same time that the bishops in the Holy Roman Empire were establishing ghettos for the same purpose, which is probably where he got the idea. Britain may be an island, but it's not, an island. Under William, Jews weren't allowed to own land, or to engage in any secular business other than moneylending or medicine. But based on the writing of the time, the early Norman conquerors seemed to have a weird affinity for their Jewish subjects, being as they were one of the few substantive links to the Old Country. In 1092, the abbot of Westminster, Gilbert Crispin, published a disputation he'd had with a local Jew who'd been educated at the yeshiva in Mainz. And it's the nicest medieval disputation you'll ever read. See, when the Normans conquered England, they didn't just install a new king. They imposed an entirely new social order, with nobles hailing exclusively from Normandy, Brittany, and Flanders, a prefab hierarchy of French-born bishops and abbots, and French as the official language of law and government. In fact, there's a fair amount of evidence to suggest that the Jews of England never adopted English as their first language. Middle English developed when Norman lords had children with native English women, which the Jews of England never did. And though I'm getting ahead of myself, the Jewish community there didn't survive long enough to see Anglo-Norman French die out. If you were a permanent resident of 12th century England and your only language was French, you were either Jewish or the king. Jewish rights further expanded under King Henry I, enabling them to be tried by a jury and to swear on the Torah instead of the Christian Bible in secular legal proceedings. But things took a dark turn during the contested reign of Henry's nephew, Stephen of Blois. One thing I didn't mention about the Rhineland massacres on my episode on the First Crusade is that one of the reasons Jewish communities were targeted so aggressively was because nobody kept secure copies of receipts, so Gentile debtors could erase all records of their debts by killing their creditors and burning their houses down. While England's Jews had peacefully weathered that particular storm, King Stephen personally brought the practice to England when he burned down the house of a Jew who refused to pay the king's expenses. Stephen didn't personally see his actions as a threat to the Jewish community overall, but many of his subjects did, and while Stephen actually tried to stop further violence, the damage was done. In 1144, a 12-year-old boy named William of Norwich was found dead, and the community at large responded by attempting to charge the entire Jewish population of the city of committing a human sacrifice in ecclesiastical court. This didn't work, but the debut of the blood libel in England led the local clergy to elevate William to sainthood. This canonization was never recognized by the Catholic Church. This wasn't just dangerous for the Jews, it was a mess for royal administration. Without a third party to record debts, the death of a single Jewish moneylender could result in years of protracted legal disputes. Nobody knew who owned what, and managing a treasury is one of the most basic things a government is supposed to do. In 1186, when the richest man in England died, a Jewish lender named Aaron of Lincoln, his assets automatically became the property of the king, Henry II. But as nobody knew how much money Aaron had, Henry had to set up a special exchequer just to figure it out, Aaron's original Jewish executor having been killed along with all 150 members of his family by a disgruntled debtor. This accounting process outlasted Henry's entire reign, as well as that of his son. As far as misunderstood relationships with Jews go, Richard the Lionheart is right up there with Pompey the Great. Apparently, Richard had had a sufficiently good relationship with the Jews of London that they were comfortable bringing gifts to the new king's coronation, even though Jews were forbidden from witnessing such a sacred event. When they were refused entry, rumors spread throughout the city that Richard had ordered the Jews to be killed, and the ensuing wave of violence resulted in hundreds of murders. Richard was furious, but unable to punish any but a few of the killers, as many of them had been respected members of the nobility, and Richard himself had only been in England for a few months. As soon as he departed on the Third Crusade, the killings resumed, this time all over the country, 150 dead in York alone. In his stead, Richard appointed the Bishop of Ely, William de Longchamp, as regent. While de Longchamp worked quickly to quell the unrest against the Jews in the cities, he also specially targeted them with orders to pay a disproportionate share of Richard's ransom. Oh yeah! On the way back from the Third Crusade, Richard was accused of murder and held for a ransom of 150,000 English marks, the same amount Richard had raised to go on the crusade in the first place. And to pay it off, de Longchamp ordered 5,000 of the marks to be paid collectively by England's Jews, 3 times as much as the share paid by the city of London, which had twice the population. Now, to understand what happened next, we need to go back to the Third Crusade. Despite being bitter enemies, Richard and Saladin had kind of become friends. Richard was constantly impressed by Saladin's army, his administration, and most notably for our purposes, the institutionalized tolerance of Jews under the leadership of the Nagid. This was why Richard had invited the great Maimonides to return to England with him, and though Maimonides had turned him down, the idea had stuck. Richard himself never actually returned to England. Let's be real, he hated England. But he remained proactive in its governance following his release from captivity. These persecutions of Jews weren't just immoral or illegal. They were a way for rebellious lords and representatives of the church to defraud the crown, and if they could get away with that, they could get away with anything. So in 1194, Richard issued the Ordinance of Jewry, establishing a permanent exchequer for all transactions by Jewish moneylenders and mandating duplicate receipts to be held by third parties. No more murdering your way out of debt. Just after Richard's death in 1199, King John approved the Jews' election of Jacob of London as Christian Europe's first Nagid, though they preferred the Latin term Presbyter Judiorum. And if you're wondering about Aaron of Lincoln's accounts, they were finally settled in 1201, 15 years after his death. But like a good Plantagenet, King John insisted that Aaron's money be transported to the royal treasury in Normandy. The ship carrying it sank in the English Channel, and 3 years later, Normandy itself was seized by the French crown. But times were changing. The same ties to the continent that had brought the Jews to England would also play a part in their departure. In 1205, Pope Innocent III, yes, that pope, decreed that Jews were servants of sin, eternally condemned to persecution by the political powers that be as punishment for Jesus' crucifixion. 10 years later, he convened the Fourth Lateran Council, which officially mandated Roman Catholic states to forbid Jews from public office and required Jews to wear the infamous badge, allegedly so as to prevent Jewish men from seducing Gentile women into interfaith marriages. You know, that thing that totally happens. Despite the Pope's aspirations, these provisions were not implemented across Christendom. The Spanish states notably ignored them for the time being, and King John was quick to drag his feet on any such restrictions. But the Archbishop of Canterbury was quick to implement them after John's death. And as the emergence of large, continent-spanning Italian banking networks from the Crusades made Jewish moneylenders economically disposable, local lords like Simon de Montfort relished the opportunity to rid their holdings of any Jewish population. But the invocations against Jews did not end with Christian forces. In the wake of the death of Maimonides, many Jews opposed to his teachings attempted to weaponize these persecutions against their intellectual rivals. In France, rabbis Jonah Gerandi and Salomon de Montpellier sought to shut out Maimonidean philosophy by raising some dubious comparisons between the Mishneh Torah and the tenets of the Cathars, a Gnostic breakaway sect of Christians based in southern France who had recently been exterminated by Pope Innocent. But this worked all too well. When Dominican friars began collecting and burning copies of Maimonides' works, the anti-Maimonideans lost their credibility, and many became Maimonideans themselves. In France, the Catholic powers that be developed a taste for burning Jewish books. In 1240, Nicolas Donat, a Jewish-born Franciscan friar, presented 35 articles against the Talmud to Pope Gregory IX, claiming that the volumes contained defamatory statements against Jesus and Mary. The Pope was shocked that Jews had any books other than the Bible to begin with, and so King Louis IX of France put the Talmud on trial, to be defended by Rabbi Sirvive de Paris, better known as Yechiel de Paris, Mose de Coucy, Judas d'Amelon, and Samuel of Château-Thierry. The accuracy of Denon's claims were dubious at best. Jesus is just the French rendering of the name Yehoshua, of which there were a great many in ancient times. One of the Jesuses mentioned in the Talmud is a student of Yehuda ben Perachia, and thus would have lived a century before the famous Jesus of Nazareth. Another is the stepson of a contemporary of Akiva ben Yosef, and thus would have lived a century later. In the words of Rabbi Yechiel himself, not every Louis born in France is a king. But these people weren't characters in the Bible, so no member of the Christian delegation thought they could be anyone else. King Louis, who had promised to protect Yechiel during the trial, exclaimed in rage that instead of debating religion with a Jew, a good Christian should run his sword through a Jew. The rabbis, for their part, struggled to explain how Judaism works, with its schools of jurisprudence and consensus building in contrast to the very top-down autocracy of Roman Catholicism. Ultimately, Louis banned ownership of the Talmud and had 12,000 copies publicly burned in the Place de Grève. Less than halfway through that year, Pope Gregory died, and his prohibition on the Talmud was overturned by his successor, Innocent IV. However, the protection of Jews in France only lasted as long as he did. And upon Innocent's death in 1254, King Louis expelled the Jews from his kingdom with the explicit intention of seizing Jewish property and assets, beginning a regular cycle of readmission and expulsion that would define Jewish life in France for the remainder of the Middle Ages. By this time, the situation in England had become much worse. In 1253, King Henry III issued the Statute of Jewry, which forbade Christians from working with or socializing with Jews, prohibited Jews from living in the country at all without permission from the king, and forced Jews to abide by certain Catholic rules while also forbidding them from setting foot in churches, among many other things. 2 years later, a Benedictine monk named Matthew Paris accused the entire Jewish community of England of conspiring to murder and ritually sacrifice a 9-year-old boy, Hugh of Lincoln. This was obviously not the first time a blood libel had been issued against Jews in England, but it was the first time that the king bought into it, ordering the execution of one of the city's Jews and the imprisonment of 90 more, 8 more of whom were executed for refusing to plead guilty, likely under torture. This specific blood libel would be a rallying cry for English anti-Semites right up to the Second World War. In 1275, Jews were banished from Worcester, Bath, and Gloucester, as those cities were handed over to Queen Eleanor of Castile as part of the dowry of King Edward Longshanks, the Hammer of the Scots. Most relocated to Hereford, but they wouldn't remain long. The same year, Edward issued another Statute of Jewry, this time forbidding Jews from money lending. It did grant them the right to own farms, but only for 15 years, and without any of the citizenship rights that land ownership normally conferred. They were allowed to practice skilled trades, in theory, but in the vast majority of cases, Jews were effectively barred from any such trades by merchant guilds, which were much more like cartels than modern labor unions. The real intention of the statute was clear: to force Jews to become criminals, and thus either force them to convert to Christianity or provide legal justification to get rid of them. In 1278, King Edward had all 16,000 of England's Jews arrested and 293 of them executed. He had hoped that this would entice them to convert, but for the most part that didn't happen. So on the 18th of July, 1290, he brought the announcement to England. All Jews would convert or leave the country by All Saints' Day. When that day came, all of England's Jews had departed for France, but only temporarily. In keeping with French policy at the time, they were expelled from there in 1306 and mostly resettled in Spain. Even as plays and polemics against the Jews continued to come out of England, no Jew is known to have lived there again for over 3 centuries. And as Europe entered the final century of the Middle Ages, this was becoming the new normal. For many Jewish leaders who had faced these persecutions firsthand, the answer was obvious: return to Palestine. Re-establish the foundations of the Jewish community at its source. And the idea had never seemed more appealing. After 2 centuries of fighting, the Levantine Crusades were over, and the Crusaders had lost. Special thanks to my patrons, including Jeremy Biskind, Eric Atreides, Lev Cham, Gary Davidson, Greg Maev, Vicky Nelson, and Ur Weiss. If you want to support the channel, consider becoming a patron on Patreon. Otherwise, you can always like, share, subscribe, and hit that bell. I will see you next time.